Okay, I think we're ready to start. So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the British Ambassador's residence in Ducal, and welcome to the third in a series of seminars we've been doing on Northern Ireland. The first was around the Good Friday Agreement, the second was around the economy, and today's is about democracy in Northern Ireland. We have a very distinguished panel. Joining me here today is Andrew McCormick, formerly of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Andrew retired recently and says he's enjoyed being unshackled, so I look forward to hearing what Andrew has to say. And on screen we will have from Queen's University Katie Hayward, from the University of Ulster Deirdre Heenan, and from the University of Liverpool Peter Shurlow. Each of our panellists will give a short presentation covering various aspects of democracy in Northern Ireland, and therell be an opportunity at the end for questions. Previous seminars we've had some very good questions, so no pressure, but start thinking about questions now, and we look forward to hearing those at the end. This is sort of Chatham House rules, so we want people to be as open as they feel they can in relation to talking about today's subject. I think we'll be recording this for purposes, and we may or may not screen it later once we've spoken to panellists. But we want this to be an open and frank discussion, please. I think the last thing I'll say, people who've been to the previous seminars, these aren't hand-picked panellists who will say that the UK government is completely right in relation to the protocol and everybody should just listen to them. These are independent people who will have their own views, and as previous panels have shown, their views will not always be in line with what the UK government position is, and that's fine, because this is about explaining some of the complexities that are around in Northern Ireland, and in the context of the protocol and the forthcoming elections, we think it's important for as wide an audience as possible to understand some of those complexities, with understanding being a good first step to trying to find ways through some of the complicated problems we're trying to solve. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, indeed, Rory, and thanks to the Mission and the Forum for having me this morning. I did 41 years in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, including over 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. I played a very small part in the design of those institutions, and a more significant role after they were created in terms of making them happen, implementing the agreement. So what I want to do, I've been asked to cover the structures of government and some aspects of the political focus. So bear with me, that'll be familiar to some, so bear with me on that, please, as I go through some basic facts. I'll then turn to why are these as complex, why are the structures of government so complex, and why is that then relevant in the present day to the issues we're dealing with. So 1998, two things happened at the same time in 1998. The Good Friday Agreement and the Blair government's initiative on devolution across the UK. And actually, the point I want to make first is that the scope of what the institutions deal with was not determined by the Good Friday Agreement at all, but by the principles of devolution in the UK. Indeed, a lot of the foundations were laid back in the Government of Ireland Act in 1920, the Northern Ireland Constitution Act in 1973. So the concept of devolved, reserved and transferred matters, technical and arcane, but relevant because that defines things that are devolved to the institutions, and they differ slightly across Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Reserved, which means that it's not devolved at present, but could be devolved in the future. And accepted matters include almost everything that's interesting in the Brexit context, as in nationality, immigration, taxation, state aid, subsidies, and international relations. So I was Director General for International Relations, and at one stage the Attorney General said, you don't have any powers. You as a devolved institution have no locus in international relations. Which matters, of course, given that Brexit and the protocol are by definition of that nature. So the first slide is then making the point that because so much that's important is reserved to the UK Parliament, Northern Ireland's representation in the UK Parliament is there. That also gives an easier lead in to just saying a little bit about the political parties and the nature of their standing in Northern Ireland. So we have 18 seats out of 650 in the UK Parliament, 5 main parties, 4 of which coincidentally were founded just over 50 years ago. Only one, the Ulster Unionist Party, which dominated government in the old Stormont Parliament from 1921 through to the early 70s. It's the only long-standing one. The others are all relatively new. The SDLP, Social Democratic and Labour Party, was the successor to the old Nationalist Party and is a very broad coalition of constitutional nationalists. The Democratic Unionist Party started as a protest against compromise, which was emerging in the 1960s when I was growing up in the mainstream Unionist Party, and became the dominant Unionist Party about 15, 20 years ago. Sinn Féin likes to think of itself as the successor to the party that existed before partition over 100 years ago, but in fact was only founded in 1971 and was and is linked to the tradition of republicanism, linked to what was, before the agreement, the physical force Republican movement. And they then also overtook the SDLP about 15, 20 years ago in the way that the electoral arithmetic evolved. And hence the pattern there. Alliance Party also formed in the early 70s. The interesting point is all those parties define themselves in relation to the constitutional issue, as in, should Northern Ireland be part of the United Kingdom or not? Alliance Party defines itself on that point by being neutral. But they're all, that's the nature of our politics. There have always been, and still are, very small parties which stand on other issues, be it economic or social or environmental issues, but they're not large. Others will come on to talk, I think, more about how this is evolving. So that's all to do with the generality of our politics. Turning to the Good Friday Agreement institutions themselves, what have we got? We've got an assembly with 90 members elected by the single transferable vote form of proportional representation, with 5 seats for each of the Westminster constituencies. This shows the makeup of the assembly that was elected in January of 2017. It shows the balance of power across the parties. You can see the small ones, which I'll not deal with at the present time, but you can see the big blocks. And I put up the Westminster constituencies first because it's easier to see that than this next slide, which shows the 5 seats. All sourced easily from the web. Some of them may be yours. Good. But that's you did use then green for green, even though green's already taken by the SDLP and Sinn Féin. But how could you not understand? Just different shades of green, and quite a different point being made, of course. So the nature of the institutions then are that the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister are nominated respectively from the largest political parties of the largest and second largest political designations. That was a change made in the St Andrews Agreement of 2006. Departmental ministers, except so far for the Department of Justice, are nominated using the DONT methodology. And in 2017, that led to 3 departments having DUP ministers, 2 Sinn Féin, and 1 each from the UUP and SDLP, with then Alliance under the special arrangement for Justice being appointed to that ministry. That's the Assembly and the Executive. The other strand of institutions I need to mention then is the North-South Ministerial Council, which oversees North-South cooperation, and 6 implementation bodies which were created in that agreement and have executive functions on an all-island basis. Quite small areas of administration, but again, part of the agreement was that those institutions should have, quote unquote, the capacity to develop. So NSMC meets in plenary and in bilateral format and takes decisions by the agreement of both sides, but it has executive functions, and I think I'll come back to why that's important in a moment. And again, part of the agreement was that the Assembly and the NSMC would be mutually interdependent. You can't have one without the other, was the mantra at that time. That's not quite working out as intended. There are also institutions across involving the rest of the UK, British Irish Council, British Irish Intergovernmental Council, but they're not executive bodies, so I'm going to gloss over them for the present time. What the agreement did include were a lot of checks and balances designed to ensure that there were protection for minority rights. That's a big theme. It's not an unusual theme across Europe, but it became very elaborate with issues because all the members have to designate as unionist, nationalist, or other. There have to be then protections based on those designations and ways in which certain matters can only be decided by votes on a cross-community basis. And if a significant minority registers an objection, then that can lead to a requirement that something only a decision is only taken if there is cross-community support. So everybody knew in 1998 that these would be complex and difficult institutions to operate. That's proved true. There have been many dramas, withdrawals, on-off devolution. One of my colleagues used to describe them that said our politicians always have an annual excursion to the brink. And we're very close to a brink at the present time, as I have to say. So that's purely factual and historical. I think go back a stage, because in order to explain why they are as they are, I need to do a very simplified version of Irish history. And unlike Barry McElduff, after there was a little scuffle in the Great Hall in Parliament Buildings about 20 years ago, and someone said, "Who started it?" And Barry McElduff, the Sinn Féin MLA, piped up and said, "Oh, the Brits started it in the 12th century." So I won't go quite back that far, but let me go back to pre-partition and the which one is this? Yes, that's the population distribution. There are probably maps like that across the whole of Europe, with 3 or 4 different colours on them. But here's a complex society with minorities and majorities without clear boundaries. So how do you draw a boundary around anybody on that map? It's practically impossible. But what we have is a divided society, and that hasn't changed that much. Sorry, yes. So that's the 2011 census, showing that the pattern of distribution isn't much different. One thing that subtly is different is that the colorways are different. The cartographers just decided to use different balances of color. So I'll leave Rory to explain why Derry is blue on both of those maps. No idea. That's a trick question. We'll come back to that later. But serious and subtle point I think others will come on to is that in the 1911 census, it talks in more absolute terms. This is proportions, whereas in 2011, the legend says that's about the relative position. And the underlying point is that there are a lot more others than there used to be in Northern Ireland. And I think that's actually a really important point, which I think others will build on. What that means is that power sharing is necessary. So the reason for the elaborate nature of the institutions, and this has been well established from the 70s onwards, is that there has to be power sharing. Every constitutional initiative has had that. Now, There are more questions about the need for that today than there were then, but in a divided society with minorities who feel the risk of being exploited, and of course, in the 1920s, we had what was called a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people, and a government which had very little regard for minority rights. So that's a major, major step which has been well understood and well established, not liked by everybody, but it's there. Power sharing is absolutely central. And then the second point, this is just still elaborating on that point, making the point that this slide is really to show that even pre-partition, all the parties defined themselves as unionist or nationalist. So maybe power sharing wouldn't have been necessary if you had parties that identified themselves on economic and social issues across the divide, but that wasn't the case. Therefore, given that you've got electoral standing only on the basis of identity, you have to protect minority rights in some way. So that's important as well. And where am I going next? So, yes. So, the other important question, given that in 1919, self-determination was a thing, as in Woodrow Wilson's principles and so on. The question is, what is self-determination in the Irish context? So, why should there be such a thing as Northern Ireland? Why do we have a border where it is between one part of Ireland and another? What correctly should be the unit of determination? And this matters for two reasons, because before 1998, the Irish Constitution did not recognise the border. There was a territorial claim. The Irish Constitution said that the national territory is the island. Also before 1998, the Armed Force Republican movement argued that the last time the whole of the island voted, they had voted for an independent Ireland, not partitioned. So the argument was that partition and the border were illegitimate. And the absolute centre of the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement was a basis on which the border would be accepted, that the principle of consent by a majority in Northern Ireland, that had been talked about from the 70s onwards, was adopted even in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, but it was contrary to the Irish Constitution. The 1998 agreement changed that, and it changed it by having simultaneous referenda, north and south, which endorsed the Good Friday Agreement and changed the Irish Constitution. So the way I would put it is that the large unit of determination, that is the island, agreed formally by 94% in the south and 70% in the north that partition would stay, that Northern Ireland would remain part of the UK unless and until a majority in Northern Ireland voted otherwise. So what's the point of all of that? The point of all of that is that Northern Ireland and the border are legitimate on the basis of the Good Friday Agreement. And maybe I go into more of a personal opinion when I say only on the basis of the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that's important to recognise. So what I would say is that unionists are right to say that Northern Ireland is part of the UK and that needs to be respected and acknowledged in everything we're doing at the present time. But they also need to recognise that it's on the basis of the agreement which enshrined the creation of the North-South institutions. The explicit phrase used in the negotiations in the 1990s was a trade of constitution for institutions. So enormous compromise, on the unionist side to accept North-West institutions, given that that's what brought down the Sunningdale Agreement in 1974. So a very big step by David Trimble to accept them. What he got in exchange was explicit recognition of partition and an enormous concession by the Irish government to change the constitution. And I had a conversation in Martina Anderson's office in the European Parliament a couple of years ago, where I said to her how significant it was that they, as the Republican movement in Sinn Féin, had acquiesced with the partition. That they will hardly ever say so, but that's what happened. That's why the balance of the agreement is so important and so delicate and very significant in the present context. So that's what I wanted to say. We haven't gone on too long. Thank you, Rory.
That's great. Thanks very much, Andrew. Really interesting, and I think particularly those points towards the end are something that is probably not well understood. So a really good start to our event. I think I hand over now to Deirdre Heenan from the University of Ulster, who will give us her perspective. Over to you, Deirdre. Thanks.
From a warm but wet Belfast, I hope you've all got strong coffee and sweet buns, because we're going to have a little chat about consociationalism, which isn't actually light for a Monday morning. So I won't go into the detail. I'm assuming some knowledge, but I'm just going to try to skim over it, link to what Andrew has said and what I know Katie and Pete will say about the discussions that are going on at the moment in Northern Ireland around our devolved structures. Do they work? Around consociationalism, around devolution, does it work? Around the Good Friday Agreement, is it fit for purpose? And so to try and tie all of those strands together, but most importantly, the rise of the other in Northern Ireland and what it means for consociationalism. So consociational democracy rests on the idea of granting certain collective and political rights to the most powerful ethno-cultural groups, a mandatory coalition, as it were, between unionists and nationalists. And I suppose this short presentation is saying, perhaps that was fit for purpose following the Good Friday Agreement. The question that is on many lips today is it still fit for purpose? And if it isn't, how can we change it within the limits of collective agreement? So next slide, please. So consociationalism, there are two core mutually reinforcing ideas behind the Good Friday Agreement. That Northern Ireland is a deeply, indeed irrefutably divided society between two competing ethno-national communities. And consociationalism provides the democratic form of governance that can accommodate this. On that first slide, I would suggest now increasingly amongst political scientists, amongst politicians and civic society, those two ideas are increasingly being challenged. That idea of a deeply divided community, we have moved on, and we will see that with the rise of groups that call themselves other, the rise of the Alliance Party, so that people become irritated when Northern Ireland is described as two large groups, orange and green, because there is a third group, and that third group is increasing. That third group is around in many senses younger people, and of course there's a class issue in there as well. I don't have time to go into all of that, but just to highlight that. So that idea is being challenged. And secondly, the idea that consociationalism is the only way forward, the only way that we can accommodate the particular issues in Northern Ireland, and that it's the governance arrangement that we desperately want. I think that is increasingly being challenged as well. Next slide. So it's suggested that the Good Friday Agreement accepts and legitimizes the two ethno-national communities, unionists and nationalists, and seeks to promote a form of politics that treats them as autonomous, fixed, and equally valid. So these two groups, the unionists and nationalists, these are the two groups that we're accommodating. I can tell you from my own groups of students, I can tell you from my own children, I can tell you from living in Northern Ireland, that I don't think that's valid any longer, that increasingly young people do not identify as orange and green. And unsurprisingly, like other global societies, they are more interested in the future of the climate. They're more interested in the economy, the future of their jobs. And of course, these are the young people that have lived through 6 years of Brexit negotiations, COVID-19, and are now looking at the Third World War and saying, really, Northern Ireland, I think you need to see the bigger picture here, because we are frankly exhausted with these conversations that seem so irrelevant in a global world, and remembering that these young people particularly are living in a global world. They are much less interested in the nuances of Northern Ireland, and what you get when you have those type of conversations is an eye roll to say, are you serious? Are you really serious that you're having a conversation about groups within unionism, groups within nationalism? There's a big world out there. Next slide, please. So going on from what I'm saying, so contrary to the presumed nature of things, the way it is in Northern Ireland, the fact that we're a place apart, those people that simply cannot get along, that is how we are increasingly depicted. And as an academic, I can tell you the frustration of reading a book about the health service in Ireland, and the first line says, but of course not Northern Ireland, because we don't include it in this book. And then you go along to a book around the health service in the UK, and the first line says, but of course Northern Ireland, because we don't include it in this book, because they are a place apart. And there is an increasing disengagement from that idea of the traditional politics. That's the way it is, and that's the way it always has to be. I think there is an increasing challenge. And that is coming, of course, because of the rise of the other, the non-aligned, the middle ground. And I could probably give you 20 more descriptions of that middle ground, but it's the alliance, it's the Greens, it's people who just don't automatically see themselves as one or the other. And those traditional lines are blurred, particularly in the younger generation. And we see that by voting patterns, but we also see it through opinion polls, such as the Northern Ireland Life and Times, that reports increasing numbers of people uncomfortable with those labels or simply not recognising those labels. Next slide, please. And I think in terms of governance, scholars are increasingly saying, has the system that we thought was appropriate, that we accepted was appropriate after the Good Friday Agreement, has it actually led to democratic advance? Do people feel comfortable with a mandatory coalition? Are they happy with the system of government they have, that we don't have a traditional opposition, that we have a 5-party executive where it's almost impossible to get agreement? But more fundamentally for us, when we look at our public sector and our public services, we find our hospital waiting lists way out of line with any other region of the UK, that public services have not been well served by this system, that the economy has not been well served. We see the debate going on around the Northern Ireland Protocol, and how does that impact on Invest Northern Ireland, encouraging people to come here with foreign direct investment? It's a very mixed message. And if you look at the figures, unfortunately, Northern Ireland remains top of every league table that we do not want to be the top of. And the question is often asked to me, is this as good as it gets? When Nuffield Trust came to Northern Ireland and we looked at the health service, they were appalled by the apathy in Northern Ireland, that we simply accepted this dreadful public sector performance, that every single target was missed. And there appeared to be zero accountability and a kind of apathy to say, well, quite frankly, we used to kill each other, so this is better. And so that raises for me the question of, is this as good as it gets? How far can we reform the system of governance within the Good Friday Agreement? And for me, that's a very important issue, because increasingly students and commentators will say, if you suggest that we really need a reform to deliver better governance, you will get a pushback to say, well, what about the Good Friday Agreement? The Good Friday Agreement is sacrosanct. And there is a confusion between how we can change our structures of governance and remain within the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, that one is not a threat to the other. So put quite simply, for many people in Northern Ireland, they could be forgiven for saying our choice is simply a choice between bad governance and no governance. And we've had 3 years of no governance, a 3-year period of drift where we weren't in direct rule, but we didn't have local democracy either. Next slide. So it does raise a number of questions. I don't have the answers for these. I'm just raising the questions. Is the power sharing executive, that 5-party executive, really the best way forward? And realistically, within any other region of the UK, could you imagine that type of government and how unwieldy it would be? And would you be surprised by the fact that you mightn't like the outcomes and that it would be extraordinarily difficult to get any form of accountability? Because what you would, of course, naturally get is an awful lot of finger pointing and saying, well, that's not what I wanted. And we don't really have cabinet responsibility. And that was so evident during COVID-19, where we would have had a decision announced at the 6 o'clock news, and by 6:15, the individual parties coming out and saying, well, it's not what we wanted. We absolutely wanted something different. And people looking at this saying, this is our government. This is a global health emergency. And still we have to come out and say, isn't really what I wanted. So I don't think we really managed that collective responsibility either. So another question is, can we realise the principles of the Good Friday Agreement and create better government? And I believe if you ask the man and woman on the street, they are much less interested in border polls, identity, tribal identities, and much more interested in what social policy people refer to as the bread and butter issues. What's going to happen to my children? What about the education system? What about health? What about social care? Do we have a system of social care that's fit for purpose? Absolutely not. Why are 1 in 4 people in Northern Ireland on hospital waiting lists? And just to give you an example for that, for neurology, orthopedics in Northern Ireland, you can now expect to wait 8 years until you get a diagnosis and then go back on the queue for treatment. So what we really have is a 2-tier system, which we don't talk about. Those people who can pay will pay, and those people who cannot pay will languish in pain on waiting lists with absolutely no idea as to how we're going to deal with that. So given the growth of non-binary identities in Northern Ireland, the question I would pose is, are these structures actually fit for purpose in terms of delivery, accountability, transparency? And that the Northern Ireland polity is no longer about unionism versus nationalism. And that is then not reflected in how those political institutions were set up and how our rules work. Next slide. A larger centre ground means that there is pressure for change. And of course, we have to guarantee these rights for nationalists and unionists. But those rights should also be accorded to the non-aligned. Why should they be different, have fewer rights? And that type of conversation, which is going on, I believe will mark a profound change in the nature of Northern Ireland politics. But a note of caution, I think we can do it. I think we can deliver better government, because I don't think many people would stand over and say, I'll die in a ditch for this system when we look at what it has delivered. The difficulty, I believe, is that a brokerage of a new system requires trust between the British government, the Irish government, and the political parties. And I leave you with a bit of an understatement to say that post-Brexit trust is fairly thin on the ground, is to put it mildly. And I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. Really very interesting, and I'm sure people will be thinking about questions around the growing middle ground. It's something I'm interested in myself as somebody who left a long time ago when it was fairly small. I think we hand over now to Peter from University of Liverpool. Peter, I hope you've recovered from the rugby on Saturday. I'm just about recovered myself. Oh, is he not? Apologies. Sorry, I can't really see the screen. Katie, we'll hand over to you, and hopefully we can get Peter. Maybe he hasn't recovered from the rugby on Saturday. Over to you, Katie.
Thanks very much, Rory. Good morning, everybody. I wish I was there in person. And just a small apology in advance in that I have to leave in 10 minutes to literally run across Botanic Gardens to give a keynote at Queen's. So I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, but please do get in touch with me if you have any questions arising from this. So basically, I'm going to jump right in and talk about the protocol, and most specifically around the question of public opinion and how that might or might not affect the election on the 5th of May. Next slide, please. So this polling has been done by Lucid Talk on behalf of Queens for our post-Brexit governance project. And we've been conducting these polls since March last year. So we have 4 that we are able to look upon now and see how the patterns of change or have occurred or not since last year. So I'm just going to share a few slides showing our results in that regard. So this is in relation to a time series. We've been asking consistent questions throughout the 4 polls. One of the questions is the protocol on balance good? And you can see here just quite how different the views are between strong nationalists and strong unionists. So people are asked to identify themselves as strong unionists, slight unionists, neither, slight nationalist, or strong nationalists. And I think this in and of itself is quite telling, i.e. the fact that they more or less mirror opposites, those who have strong opinion around the constitutional question. You can see strong nationalists very much thinking protocols on balance good, strong unionists thinking very much that it's on balance a bad thing. Next slide, please. However, to get to the area that Deirdre is pointing to, the moderates, you can see how different the picture is there. Now, nationalists are very much of the view that the protocol is on balance good. And we saw a particular change from October last year, possibly in response to the experiences that were being had in Britain with respect to the impact of Brexit, food supply shortages, briefly, etc., etc. But we saw a change there in October, and that's been sustained since. You can see here the neithers. They are also of the view that the protocol is on balance good, and again, that became much more firm from October last year. Those 2 groups very much on the Remain camp. And then you can see slight unionists. They are of the view that the protocol is on balance bad, but you can see how different their views are compared to those who are strongly unionist. Next slide, please. As you'll be aware, an interesting feature of the protocol is Article 18, which allows for a democratic consent vote, so-called, in the first instance at the end of 2024 on the continued application of Articles 5 to 10. This immediately makes the protocol an electorally relevant issue. Next slide, please. So we have asked in our poll since the beginning of last year, how would you like your MLAs to vote in that democratic consent vote? I've got there the pattern of results that we've had since March last year. And really, you can see there hasn't been a dramatic change, except that those who say they have no preference or no interest in it have gone down. And there's been a movement towards, instead, they seem to have become more in favor of full application of the protocol. So now we have 50% saying that they'd like the full application of the protocol and the MLAs to vote for continued application of Articles 5 to 10, versus 42% who would like their MLAs to vote against that. And bearing in mind the margin of error is plus or minus 2.3%. Only 8% don't have an interest or preference. Next slide, please. And then the question is, well, how does that particular question inform your choice of candidate when it comes to actually casting your vote? Interestingly enough, that really has not changed significantly over the course of the 4 polls. The consistency there is almost remarkable. And what we can see is consistently 1 in 5 saying a candidate's position won't affect how they will vote. You can see there 27% saying they will only vote for candidates who are in favour of scrapping the entire protocol, 10% against continued application of Articles 5 to 10, and then 43% they'll only vote for candidates who are in favour of continued application of the protocol. And my last slide is just to break it down into looking at where that pattern comes from. I think this is very interesting. So nationalists, light and strongly, will only generally vote for candidates in favour of supporting the protocol. And we know that nationalist parties, the CSDP and Sinn Féin, are in favour of that anyway, so that won't affect their choice. We see strongly unionists, mainly DUP, TUV supporters, very much of the mind that they will only vote for candidates who are against the protocol. 65%, almost 2/3, saying they'll only vote for candidates in favour of scrapping the entire protocol. But look at those who are slightly unionist and who are neither. The slightly unionists, would expect them generally to vote for the Ulster-Unionist Party. Almost 1 in 2 say it will not affect their choice of candidates. We see how, in some ways, unimportant the protocol is for those who are softer unionists. Although, like 1 in 5 is in favour of the protocol, and 4 out of 10 being more or less against it. And then we see with the neithers as well, even though the Alliance Party, for example, is pro-Remain, you can see that there's also, and majority of them would like the full application of the protocol. You can see there too, other issues are more important. And I think this relates to Deirdre's point. So to conclude, what will be interesting in this election is whether it will be all about the protocol, given that we know that the protocol will be very much featuring, particularly in the DUP's campaign with respect to the election. And if it is all about the protocol, we can expect to see DUP supporters mobilised by that, and the potential to put off those who are not interested in that particular issue and are interested in other issues, such as the ones that Deirdre is referring to, because we see a large proportion of the population who are genuinely concerned about other things. And so in this way, the election will be very significant for Northern Ireland's future, whether it be around the continuation of the protocol or more generally around the continuation of power sharing. It's a real crunch election, I think, for the Good Friday Agreement. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Katie. Another interesting presentation. So that, I think, unless, has Peter appeared? No. That's it for the presentations. So it's now over to the audience for questions. How are we managing people who are online versus people in the room? Okay. So why don't we try in the room first, and then we can go online. So anybody in the room got a question for the panelists?
Hello, thank you. My name's Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open. I kind of really wanted to ask about the government position in a sense. You know, Liz Truss has said she would put on hold triggering Article 16 for the moment because of Ukraine. And she wants to create green lanes and all sorts of things. So what is the government plan to unblock the blockages? Because we have to get on with so many more things to do. And it's blocking Horizon, it's blocking, and even, you know, foreign policy coordination's improving, but we need more of it. So what is the plan? Thank you.
Who wants to answer that? So look, I'd say 2 or 3 things. I don't think Liz Truss has said that Article 16 has been put on hold because of Ukraine. The government position remains that Article 16 is part of the protocol, and if a sustainable solution cannot be negotiated, Article 16 remains an option. But if, well, there you are. But I do think, I'm sure I saw other stories in the Telegraph that didn't agree with that. But look, I think the Ukraine thing is very important, and of course, as Deirdre said, and I'm sure as everybody thinks, it does put some of this into perspective, and that's something that I'm sure the government is thinking about. It also demonstrates that the UK and the EU, when the chips are down, think along similar lines and have worked very well together in relation to sanctions and other issues around the Ukraine conflict. The government's position remains that they want to try and find a durable, sustainable solution to the problems of the protocol, fundamentally built on goods destined for sale in Northern Ireland being subject to no or very few checks going GBNI. And we remain keen and continue to talk to the Commission about seeing whether we can solve that problem. Clearly, bandwidth is taken up with the Ukraine crisis at the minute, and so whilst talks continue, not much progress is currently being made. But the government would like to solve this problem with Northern Ireland. Liz Truss definitely has been clear that there are bigger problems in the world that we need to deal with, and that's before the Ukraine situation started. So hopefully it will create some momentum to try and find a way through. But the government does want to find a durable solution. I mean, without getting into what the various opinion polls and things say, and Katie's survey. You know, the people in Northern Ireland tend to polarise. So the Unionists broadly against the protocol, Nationalists broadly in favour of the protocol. My sense is from people I know back there that the experience of the protocol is broadly the same. There are some problems, but one side says, therefore, get rid of it. The other side says, well, can you find a way of fixing it? I think if we could find a way of making movement of goods, GBNI, much easier than it currently is, then that would help with the situation on the ground, and that's what the government wants to do.
Hi folks, Nicholas White here. Good to see you guys on the screen, and good to see Andrew in person. Two questions really. One of them is the sort of theoretical spin-off from Deirdre's presentation. Why is it that political parties are not adopting a position of actually giving voters what they want, and why is it that voters are not voting for what you think they want and what I think they want, which is better actual provision of public services? What's gone wrong in the connection between voter desire and voter behaviour? And my second question for all of you is, what do you think the trigger might be that the Secretary of State might use to say, well, it is time to put the proposition of a United Ireland to an electoral test? I have a bit in the Irish Times this morning with my views, but I would like to know. I would like to know yours. Thank you. Sorry, Irish News. Did I say Irish News?
Deirdre, do you want to try and answer the first one?
Well, yeah. Hi, Nicholas. How are you? It's a difficult question. It's one that we ask ourselves many times, and it's one that, you know, commentators will say, well, you know, why do we keep repeating voting in people who clearly cannot deliver what it is we say we want? There are many reasons for that. Of course, in Northern Ireland, we would have imagined that so far after the Good Friday Agreement, we would no longer be in the position of saying it's not about voting for a group because of what they can deliver. It is about voting for a group to keep another group out. And we are still in that position. And political parties are quite blatant about it. So you will see that there has been some attempt to frame this upcoming election as preventing Sinn Féin from taking the First Ministry. And the debate between the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister. And I'm not getting into all of that, but it's how it's being framed. So it's not about voting for someone because of their manifesto and their policies and what they're going to deliver. It is essentially, if you don't vote, the fear will be that the others might get in, or we may lose some of our power. We may lose some of our ability to control. And I think there is still a fear factor. But people are increasingly saying, listen, Sinn Féin had the Deputy First Ministership and the sky didn't fall in. So I think increasingly what politicians will find is that they are, the public are less convinced by that. I think there's another issue in Northern Ireland in that many in the middle classes feel a plague on all their houses for the executive and be quite happy to see it coming down, because their view is that many people in Northern Ireland are simply playing politics. And because we don't have tax raising powers, because unlike Scotland, we're not looking for more powers, the reality is the government in Northern Ireland is still very much about getting a cake and dividing it out. And it's a little bit for you and a little bit for me, and it's shared out rather than a shared future. And until we can get to some idea of what a shared future might look like and people buy into it, I think we're always going to be in this conundrum of a shared out future. And that's because of fear. And for me, the practicalities, just to give you one, we've been talking for over 2 decades about underachievement in Protestant working class communities. We have delivered zilch. And I think it is time that the Citizens' Assembly and people start saying, let's forget about zero-sum politics and have a look at the delivery. And when you look at it, it is not a happy picture. So I think the tide is slowly beginning to turn. And another thing which will make a big change, and I'll finish on this, is the cost of living. Northern Ireland is the poorest region with the highest levels of deprivation, and fuel increases will really make a huge difference to many people's lives. In my view, that will be that will trump the protocol, no matter what people think about identity. There are people who are genuinely worried about the future, the incoming winter, and how they are going to survive.
Thanks, Deirdre. Andrew.
Can I come in on both that point, on Nicholas's second point? Unintended consequences. So the Good Friday Agreement set up things a certain way, but leads to the incentive for the parties is to maximise their own vote, getting their own core vote out. What they focus on is getting good turnout. There's no incentive in the Good Friday Agreement structures to appeal across the divide or appeal to the middle ground. That wasn't the intention. The only thing that was put into the agreement that worked against that, and this is another bit that hasn't worked, was the idea of a programme for government. So the agreement says that the executive will agree a programme for government, including an agreed budget. They rarely have. It was a bit better 20 years ago because the UUP and the SDLP were the ones that had committed to the agreement and designed it. They did try to do that. 07 and the DUP, Sinn Féin in charge, they're much more polarised, much less willing to work together. The tension is palpable. In the executive meetings just don't work because there's no incentive to agree. They hate each other so much. That's part of what is going on and part of the reality we live with. And then, but still, to me, stabilising things now and sorting out the issue of the protocol, to me, is much more important than looking at a border poll at this point. The condition, as in the Good Friday Agreement, is, it's there, but the Secretary of State can call a poll when there's a reasonable indication that it might pass, and the opinion polls, the voting patterns don't suggest that at the present time. This is to me something that Sinn Féin in particular have raised because of the destabilisation that has arisen from Brexit, and why wouldn't they? That's good political opportunism from their point of view, but actually solving the protocol issue. So I need to assert my moral right as having the copyright on green lanes from a paper I did in February 2018. They're getting that issue, finding a way to make that work, sorting that out, given that that's very difficult to apply to agri-food in practical terms. There are real difficulties, and facing up to the fact that solving that is genuinely difficult. We felt, a couple of years ago that it was not sufficiently understood, the nature of the way trade worked, but a practical, de-dramatised solution that applies something, because there has to be a permanent solution and the choices are limited, as in the famous trilemma. So facing up to that logic and sorting it out, to me, is the priority.
Say as well that...
Katie, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'll say something very briefly, and then apologies, I'll have to leave you. But I look forward to reading your article, Nicholas. So as you know, the Secretary of State is obliged to call the border poll if it looks likely that there's going to be a majority in favour of Irish unification. And I was part of a working group led by UCL last year that looked at the various options that the Secretary of State would have for assessing such a majority to be in existence. So it can be, for example, Sinn Féin taking the First Minister's position, being the largest party in the Assembly, the number of seats in the Assembly being held by a nationalist majority, portion of first preference votes, census results, and polling data. It is quite telling that within our working group, we were able to assess various pros and cons of each, but we couldn't agree on which one was more important. So it's important that it's a decision for elected representatives and for the Secretary of State. And it's notable that Naomi Long recently has called for the Secretary of State to make it clear on which basis he would make that decision, because I think that takes a lot of the speculation out of it. And in making that decision, he will need a lot of evidence to be borne in mind, because it is a really complicated but crucially important issue.
Thanks very much, Katie. Sorry, is that Deirdre?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and say, though, it is important to say that we've had learning from the Brexit process, from the conversations, endless conversations about, well, what did you vote for? Well, I didn't know what I was voting for. Well, of course I expected that. Or no, I expected something entirely different. Or indeed, that wasn't the Brexit that I voted for. So I think in terms of a border poll, there will be much more reticence about voting for something until there's a much better understanding of what that might look like in terms of pensions, health, the future for people on this island. So, in my view, a border poll may happen. I don't see it happening in the near future. And I think there's an awful lot of work to be done to lay the groundwork so that people can have options, a much better understanding of what it might look like, because I think we've learnt our lesson, as it were, for voting for something that we weren't quite clear really what it was we were voting for and what the implications are. And I think also there's an increasing conversation about a border poll and a united Ireland where people are challenging unionists and nationalists, soft nationalists in particular, challenging the view that it's inevitable, that the certain outcome is inevitable. People are beginning to have discussions around what the future might look like.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm told that Peter has now arrived. Peter, I don't know if you want to quickly run through what you were going to say. I don't know when you joined, if you want to try and answer any of the questions we've just had. But over to you to maybe say a few words. Sorry, oh dear, Peter's not having a great technology day. Neither am I. Let's wait and see if we can get Peter connected, and in the meantime, we'll take a question from Fergus.
I'm happy to speak. Thank you very much. Fergus McReynolds from Make UK. I think Deirdre's presentation has clearly shown that there is a growth amongst the centre ground, but what Katie's polling also shows is that there is a polarisation on the protocol itself. There is a very strongly held view that the protocol must be replaced, and a very strongly held view that the protocol must stay. I guess Andrew's presentation clearly showed that the success of the Good Friday Agreement was buy-in politically from both sides and compromise. Where do the panelists see that compromise coming now? How do you get beyond the point of a community or a grouping, perhaps not use the term community, but a grouping who are vehemently against and a grouping who are vehemently for? And how do you create the political ownership which is necessary to move that conversation on in Northern Ireland itself?
Thanks, Fergus. Andrew, do you want to have a...
So what happened in the 90s was two governments working together with strong support from the US and from the EU to push them towards discussion, push them towards agreement. That was a very bumpy decade. My personal involvement was in 1992 when a lot of the institutions were designed, but that's, to me, what is needed is an attempt to look at things in a problem-solving, constructive mode. What I noticed when I was still within government, what I noticed even more strongly since retiring is a mood of confrontational, of win-lose, which has been the theme of the Johnson administration's negotiations with the EU. That doesn't work, and it's absolutely criminal that adopting that methodology in dealing with Northern Ireland. I go back to things like the Internal Market Bill, things that used Northern Ireland as a means of tactical play in a bigger negotiation, where the interest was what's going to suit the Brexit lobby. That doesn't work. So in a Good Friday Agreement process, with two governments, with external players assisting, maybe independent, someone like George Mitchell came and chaired talks, an independent solution that says, well, this is difficult. This is genuinely very, very difficult. How do we find the most constructive way forward?
Thanks, Andrew. Sorry, I can't see who's online. Is Deirdre still there? Just Peter. Peter, welcome. And sorry, you seem to have had IT problems. Do you want to try and answer a question, or do you want to maybe run us quickly through what you wanted to say?
I'll run through my slides if that's okay.
Great.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Sorry, I had technical problems. My computer decided to update itself and then decided to die at the same time. What I want to do very quickly here is go through where Northern Irish society is today. A lot of media, even some research commentary has a much more negative reading than I would have. So the first slide here is basically deaths in Northern Ireland relating to the conflict. You can see the high level of violence that there was in the early 1970s, and now we're down to about 10, less than 12 in the last 4 years. Deaths, and they're mostly drug feuds amongst paramilitaries. So basically, we have to understand that that sort of level of volume of violence, which targeted civilians, which created much of the sectarian reaction, has been eroded, and also has clearly, you'll see there around 1998, that the trend has been very clear. Next slide, please. So that works in many ways. What parallels that, for example, is yet again this decline in people charged with violence. So the whole nature of Northern Irish society, through this process of demilitarisation, declines in violence, is, as I'm going to suggest, creating something which is much more consensus-based than is assumed and than we're told. If you can go to the next slide, please. So here's something that's really staggering and which you just don't hear in our media. Since 2005 up to last year, sectarian crime in Northern Ireland has declined by 65%. If you think when the first assembly was formed, there were 115 killings in the first 5 years. There were 20,000 kilograms of explosives seized, and there were still significant numbers of people who were engaged in political violence, etc. Look at how this has changed. The way in which European funding, the operation of the assembly, but most certainly the operation on the ground. Civic society in Northern Irish society has started to deliver really meaningful impacts. And we'll talk about what those meaningful impacts are as you have that decline in sectarianism, which at one time defined the way in which we move through our cities, we move through our towns, who we meted, who we greeted, who we engaged with, etc. Next slide, please. So here's an example of that. You'll see the orange. The orange are the number of people who are in mixed or no religion relationships. And just a very quick point, if you're under the age of 30, you're nearly twice as likely to be in a mixed religion relationship. So what we're also seeing as the society becomes less sectarian, we're starting to see a growth in what is really meaningful, because clearly when you have these mixed relationships, then your children are coming from a hybrid background. And the hybridity of culture and identity is something which parallels the changes that are taking place. Next one, please. So here's a question, for example, about would you mind if a relative married somebody from a different religious background? And if you look to the left, the more positive people are non-voters, young Protestants, young Catholic non-voters, young Protestant non-voters, people who don't vote. So we actually have this section of our society, around 40-45% in elections, who don't engage, who tend to be the most socially liberal people in our society. There's no democratic accountability. It's basically, thus far, they generally have failed to engage with the electoral process. And if you go to the other side, you'll see that those who would mind most are those from the ethnic tribune parties who would have that type of disregard for, more likely to have a disregard for marrying across the sectarian divide. Next slide. Also, what we've had in our society is this growth in confidence in the police. Blue Catholic, here orange Protestant. And you can see since the PSNI was formed, each time this has been measured, there's greater confidence in the police. So that means there's greater confidence in a part of the state, which at one time was seen as abusive, which was seen as something in which you wouldn't locate your confidence. Next one, please. Constitutional preference, of course, is something else we measure in surveys. As you can see, the blue line is those who wish to remain in the UK. The orange line is those who wish to join the Republic of Ireland. There is some narrowing. The real decline in support for Irish unity came around the Celtic Tiger collapse in 2008, and the way in which that has now changed with a slight growth, especially in the Brexit period. But in the main, you're talking about 55-30% who are in favour of staying in the Union or joining a United Ireland. Next slide, please. If you ask this question, of course, is based upon ethnic tribune voting. The blue is the DUP, TUV, also Unionists. The Unionist parties, of course, have significant majorities of voters who are pro-union. As you go down that list, those who don't vote, those who are undecided, generally tend to be pro-union. The Alliance Party has a mix, the biggest mix of both. SDLP actually has quite a few voters who would stay within the union, and you can see that the big share of voters who wish to engage in a United Ireland, of course, are located within Sinn Féin. So there's a complexity within the political parties, especially in the middle ground, Greens, Alliance, where you get both sets of traditional voters constitutionally, and then with the more vociferous parties, you get less balance in that way. Next one, please. This is just by age, and if you look at this in the long-term future, just the very bottom is the 18 to 30s. Even amongst the 18 to 30-year-olds, where the demography is much more Catholic, you still have a slight majority. So one of the things we have to think about and discuss is Northern Ireland is not going to disappear overnight, and the likelihood of it changing constitutionally is something which is not as determined maybe as we're told. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is the survey we did in October about the protocol. We asked questions about mitigation. And what you'll see here is, this was about SPS, what was put forward by Europe. So basically, even amongst the unionist community, there was no mass rejection of that mitigation. The bottom column, there was close to 50% who were prepared to support mitigation. The yellow figure here is when you take out the don't knows, and when you do that, the majority of unionists were prepared to accept the mitigations as advanced by the European Union. Okay, next slide, please. This is the other question, the British command paper argument, which is as long as goods meet EU standards, they should move freely within Northern Ireland. And as you can see here, consensus again, even nationalists supported that. And that's one thing we find in our surveys, is people simply don't want checks on goods, north, south, or east, west, and that's between unionists and nationalists, and also that other section of our society who call themselves neither. There's much more complexity here than what we're told and what we're seeing in street protests and elsewhere. Next, please. Should the Assembly decide by simple majority what happens with the protocol? Yet again, you find majority support unionism, nationalism, and also amongst neithers. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Westminster Elections, what we've also seen since 2017 has been this growth in the Alliance Party, in grey at the bottom, and both sets of constitutional parties have declined in terms of their electoral share. So there's something that's affecting society and changes in society. And just to finish off here with the last few slides. Thank you. Next, please. The blue figure here is our most recent survey from 6 weeks ago. How do you intend to vote? And the orange is how did you vote in 2017? So you can see Sinn Féin is slightly down, DUP significantly down. That protocol politics isn't driving people to the DUP. But where you see the growth is in the third column, the Alliance Party, the Green Party, and what we're seeing here is the emergence of something which we haven't had before, which is that centre ground actually holding potentially a quarter or a fifth of votes in the next election. Next slide, please. So basically, if this pans out in our next election, what we will see is parties that support the UK slightly down, parties that support the United Ireland slightly down, and non-constitutional parties actually starting to emerge as a political force in Northern Irish society. Next, please. So this is the question of people who vote and don't vote. And one of the things you have to understand about our elections is that if you're pro-union, you're less likely to vote. Around 70% of people are pro-union vote, compared to around 82% of people who are pro-unity. And we're starting to see maybe those people who don't vote, who are pro-union, are starting to move into much more centrist politics, as are some people who are nationalists. Okay, next, please. And this is just the final slide, just to go through some things. You know, since 1998, there's been a very significant growth in the median wage. There's been a very significant growth in unemployment. Newry, for example, border town, intergenerational unemployment for decades, now has a shortage of workers. There's growth in fintech, cybercrime, media production, which are all very, very encouraging and which are developing a new economy, which is shared workforces, etc. And of course, what you also have is this Belfast is now in particular a site of profitable location. It's the top 10 tech cities of the future, ahead of Madrid, Frankfurt, Zurich, Milan, and Cambridge. I never in my life thought I would see Belfast in a list of places that are successful, as exotic and as important as those. And of course, it's now one of the 5th best mid-sized European cities for doing business, etc. So I just wanted to give you very quickly, and these slides will be sent to you, just a quick flavour of, there is another story about Northern Ireland, which is one of more consensus change and something which is not represented by the majority of our political elite in the rhetoric that they use around the protocol and constitutional questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for persevering with the technology. It was good to see your presentation. I'm conscious we've overrun by a few minutes, but a last chance for questions either in the room or online.
We've had a couple of questions online from Rory Montgomery and James Wilmot. First one is, given the vested interests of the main parties, what are the chances of agreement on changes to the Good Friday agreements that Deirdre advocates? And kind of linked to that is, could speakers expand a little more on what the implications could be for this growing move away from identity politics in Northern Ireland? What consequences might this have on behaviour, social cohesion, social unrest for those who still regard these issues as central to their lives and politics?
Thanks, Becky. Andrew, do you want to have a go at?
So, what could change? We have a mandatory coalition. The obvious step back from that is something on a voluntary basis, and there was a change to make provision for some of the parties to go into opposition, as they did in the previous assembly. UUP and SDLP chose for a while, but that left them feeling even more powerless than they had been within government. It's a dilemma, and if they're looking to, if their electoral incentive is simply to get as many of their own core base out as possible, then it's hard then not to choose not to be in government, even if you're in a maybe 1 minute, as is the case, one minister in a very difficult executive. So it is hard to see an agreed basis, something that would command the degree of support that the Good Friday Agreement did in 1998. But the case for evolution and change is as all the speakers have drawn out, getting stronger and stronger, because it is no longer, it's as Rory will know from Montgomery, from listen to his fascinating comparison with Bosnia Herzegovina, where someone who's from the other designation can never be president. So that's something intrinsically not right about that. But how to get there, I find personally very challenging. But it's definitely the journey we need to be on.
Thanks, Andrew. Peter, do you have any views on that?
Well, I think one of the things is, the society we want to evolve isn't just going to happen overnight. And clearly, you had things like fair employment in the 1970s, the housing reforms in the 1970s. Northern Ireland is a reforming place. And what really made that reform more than just the legal institutional arrangement was the way in which violence, the reduction in violence, created new modes of socialising. So if more people are marrying across the sectarian divide, if more people are working and living together, if you have a young generation in particular, which is more concerned by delayed adulthood, environmental issues, than they are with what happened in 1972, then you will see these transitions that are taking place. And one of the things that's clearly happened here is that there is a younger generation now who are voting beyond the constitutional divide. And very much the pro-union community went down that route in the last 3 or 4 elections. They stopped, significant sections of them simply stopped voting constitutionally. Either they didn't vote or they went elsewhere. And that's a big transition in our society. But it takes time and it will evolve. But the thing that's really important here is what happened in our Good Friday Agreement was it institutionalized everything to such an extent that it basically trampled upon the development of civic society. And one of the problems with our political elite in Northern Ireland is it doesn't really engage it with any rigour with business, academia, trade unions, and people who are within Northern Irish society who can build reconciliation. build a more inclusive economy, build social progression, and the exclusion of that is as much a bigger problem than the functioning of the assembly itself. It doesn't have a societal purpose in terms of arrangements with civic society.
Great. Thanks very much. I think we've seriously overrun now, so I'll just thank the panelists for their interesting presentations, thank people for attending in person and online. As I say, this is the third of 3 seminars, so unless Chris tells me otherwise, there isn't a fourth, but you never know. There's another financial year coming and money to spend. But thanks very much, everybody, for coming along. It's been good to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you.